Welcome, everyone, to the Workforce Navigator podcast. I'm Steve McDonald, your host. And today we have a very special guest. We have Tony Chimera. Tony, you are the Chief Talent Officer for Westfield Specialty Insurance. And that just starts to define you. Huge Buffalo Bills fan, big service mentality. You coach your son's basketball team, donate time at the church. You've got a big service mentality, and that is huge in business. That's part of what we're going to be talking about today. But really, the focus of today is how to be a business and HR executive at the same time. You are a C-suite executive. So you had your functional role with talent in the organization, but you also have the role in the C-suite of what is the long-term strategic development and growth plan for the company. So we're going to tap into some of that expertise of yours today. But before we start, if you wouldn't mind maybe just expanding a little bit on your background and who you are beyond what I did.
So I started my career in HR. First job I had was literally I never had an HR department before. So the executive assistant gave me a stack of resumes about that high and said, good luck. Eventually they hired my boss. So I was first, she came second. And I'd say that's the common thread through my career. Other than one experience, I've always been at kind of smaller entrepreneurial companies where you just figure stuff out in a simple sense, which I think is somewhat antithetical from some other HR environments. So as I think about my career, that's a thread that has rolled through there. I'm always focused a lot on kind of talent and particularly acquiring talent because we were always growing, but found the places that I've been most happy. It's where you can win through talent. And there are some industries where that's an ingredient, but maybe not the main ingredient. I look for it being the main ingredient, which is why ultimately I've landed in insurance for a large part of my career, because you don't make anything. You really win through what people do, their relationships, and how good they are at both of those things. So that's a little bit about me.
Great. I'm going to then launch into, we talked about before in our conversations, the idea of strategic HR. And what does strategic HR mean to you in kind of a business definition?
It's probably not HR, truthfully. I mean, in a weird way, the traditional HR functions, you think of everything from payroll to benefits to compensation to employee relations. They're more building a foundation. I think strategic HR is figuring out, as a company, how are you successful? And then aligning with that, not being a hurdle against it. There are things that you absolutely have to do from a regulatory and compliance standpoint. I'm not dismissing that, but ultimately that's the price for showing up. It's all the other stuff. And I think if you get to a point where you're enabling the business's success and not fencing it, I think that's strategic HR.
And give me a couple of good examples where you are actually directly impacting the growth, the success of the business, because I would agree that in the end, that's what we're trying to do.
Everyone at our shop has a business development function, true of my role. So I think it's developing business or bringing talent to the forefront that maybe doesn't fit in your current company model and saying, here's an opportunity for us to grow, expand, think differently. I think those are some examples. And then my pet peeve is HR initiatives. HR initiatives ultimately, again, I think fall into that more. It's apple pie. We have to do it because it tastes good and everyone else is doing it. It's all the other stuff. And it's really a business initiative where you're bringing your expertise. It's not a, hey, we have to do succession planning because if somebody leaves, I have 5 people behind that. So you absolutely have to do that. But everyone is doing that. It's the stuff that people aren't doing where you can bring your expertise and you're a business person first and an HR or a talent professional second.
You said something at the very beginning there is that your opinion is that we all have to have business development roles where a lot of people in HR, a lot of people in talent acquisition would say, I have no business development role. What is your advice? What is your recommendation to them? And why do you say we all need to have a business development role?
Ultimately, that's the difference between survival and thriving, I think, as a business. But in a lot of environments, a lot of cultures force you to stay in a certain lane. So I'm not dismissing that. But I think the way you get out of that lane is be intensely curious. Understand more about the business and the people that are actually transacting it. get out in the marketplace and understand. And in my world, it was always started with talent. But when I met somebody, I asked, okay, why are you passionate about what you do? What are you guys doing differently that we're not doing as a company? Why do you stay? Why do you leave? Those kind of things. And I think as you aggregate that information, again, you can bring a different perspective from somebody who's maybe in a traditional business development function, or in our world, in an underwriting function. And that'll lead you to a place that you may not go as a business, or a discussion that you might not have. So I think it's about curiosity, and it's about getting outside of your comfort zone. And does that help me do my job on a day-to-day basis? Maybe not. But does it help me enter that discussion that I wasn't invited to last week, last month, last year?
It's interesting because I talk to a lot of C-suite executives, CMOs, CROs, chief growth officers, chief talent officers, chief people officers, CHROs. There is a lot of imposter syndrome. There is a lot of how do I earn the seat of this table? So as a chief talent officer or a CHRO, a chief people officer, in your mind, what is that role at the table that you have? And how do you earn that?
I think it's not like you earn it and then you're done. I think it's through every action every day. Part of it is just by listening. I've worked for people before that were probably, I wouldn't even argue, they were probably smarter than I am, but they didn't know how to manage relationships. They didn't know how to listen. They thought they were smarter than everyone, again, around the table. They were there at the table, but when they left, everyone talked about them. I think the important thing is listen first. Again, be curious first before you start making proclamations. And second, with regard to imposter syndrome, like, easy to say, but if that's impeding your ability to have those conversations, you have to figure out what your ability to break through that. And it's the same thing that I say to college graduates that are nervous at job fairs. I'm like, if you don't want to go to the job fair by yourself, bring a wing person. You can do the same thing in this context. If you're not comfortable, bring someone with you who's advocating for you, and that's going to make you more comfortable. But I think everyone says a seat at the table, and I think of like Camelot, big of a deal, but you do have to earn your spot there, and you do have to earn it every time. And I think part of it starts just through listening and curiosity, in my opinion, which sounds very amorphous, but I think so few people do that.
So you brought up curiosity a number of times. And in our last conversation, you talked about the difference between having curiosity and feeding that curiosity. And so you talked about getting out and actually talking to customers, talking to prospects, talking to the talent that's coming in and why they're leaving and what they've done differently at other companies versus here. And that is feeding curiosity that then gives you the seat at the table to make recommendations, to be a contributor to that conversation.
Yeah, not even taking a notch in a different direction too, do I think doing that in a way which is reciprocal. So wanting to understand where someone else is coming from, but also understand, like, how can I help you? I mean, a little bit of a pet peeve is in a lot of industries, I think there's a lot of protectionism. So like back in the day, I remember doing a lot of recruiting, going to websites, and you wouldn't have any employees listed because the company would say, I don't want my employees out there because somebody will go poach them. And I always say, you know what? If I don't know who your good people are, I don't need your website to do that for me. But what are we afraid of? If you're keeping people happy, you should post them everywhere. So I do think that notion of being reciprocal and not just extracting information out of somebody, but sharing information and sharing leads and opportunities, like, all ships rise with the tide. I don't care if they're a competitor or a customer or somebody that's not in our industry. If you can make somebody better, I think it'll come back on you.
If you're worried about listing your people that they're going to get poached, then you have a bigger issue, which is, what's your company culture? Like, why are you retaining people? If it's that easy for them to jump ship and they want to. You talked before about key HR success strategies, and you talked about culture as one of those. What do you want us to know about company culture, and why is it key to not only HR, but to your point, like just the overall growth and the success of the business?
Yeah, I think different companies use that terminology in different ways. I've been at companies before that have the culture statement behind you and somebody's presenting and everyone in the crowd is just sitting there shaking their head going, this person should not be on that stage. They don't embody any word that is behind them. So I think number one, you have to be accountable to whatever you're saying, and everyone has to be accountable, and it can't be someone in the C-suite who behaves completely contrary, because then you have no culture. You just have a cute slide that's behind you. I think the other thing is it's the words are important. The actions are more important. And the actions range from how you behave in your group meetings to how you behave just when you're walking around talking to people. If you say you have a culture that you listen to everyone and then your executive team is never accessible, available, or interested, you don't have that culture. I also think it's important to stress test, and you have to do that in multi modes. So you can do engagement surveys. I'm a big fan of those. You need to follow up on those, by the way, but you also can do just small one-on-one or one-on-three or one-on-two meetings. And you need to ask people what we're saying. Is it still who we are? And be comfortable that sometimes you might get an answer that you didn't want, but I'd rather know that than wake up one day and have people leaving saying, yeah, what you put up on that slide or what you said in that meeting or what you said to me one-on-one is not the truth.
Yeah. The way I always think about this is if you talk to any VC firm, private equity firm, where they put their money for the desire for a huge return, they invest in the people first, the idea second. So this idea of culture, and is that a part of that curiosity? The curiosity of, are we actually delivering on an organization where people want to work here? We retain people. We don't have a churn. We don't have then to train. We don't have junior people. We have seasoned people. That to me has got to be a big part of, and it was what I took away from our last conversation, that strategic plan for growth. The people are going to get us there.
I think it's also really about alignment in everything you do. And if you're rolling out a development program or rolling out a communication, it should all thread together. And when it doesn't acknowledge that, I think the other thing is you need to, I'm a real big fan of being honest, even when it's ugly. I would rather admit, just like I tell our employees, when you make a mistake, and we're in the business of risk. So if you're not making mistakes, oh, by the way, you're probably not doing your job at the end of the day. But when you make a mistake as an individual, you should take accountability for it. When you make a mistake as a company, you should take accountability for it. And I think that it gets wrapped up in, oh, we're going to create a legal situation or we're going to look bad. You look a lot worse when you kind of, a term here in the South, put lipstick on the pig and say, oh, everything's okay. Nothing happened. Just ignore that and get on with your job. I think it's important once in a while, hopefully it's only once in a while, to say, yeah, we didn't do that. Like, we're sorry. Like, we're not going to make the same mistake again. I think people will show you some grace, but when you try and gloss it over and ignore it, you don't really deserve any grace, truthfully.
Part of doing everything that we're talking about here is also overcoming the challenges to get the job done. So there are pre-existing perceptions in the industry of HR and their role and how you contribute. And unfortunately, there's not a direct line of connection between HR and talent and strategic growth of the business, even though it seems quite obvious to us it does. How do you address these challenges? I'll let you take it from there.
I think, again, it goes back to a lot of the stuff we've talked about. I think if you're present and engaged with all groups, all levels, I think that's part of the answer. I mean, I always tell, again, I go back to students when they're considering the insurance industry, I'm like, you're going to go to a party. People are going to ask what you do, and you're going to say insurance, and you'll clear 3/4 of the room. Imagine if then somebody asks them, what do you do specifically in insurance or HR? Then the whole room's cleared. So I do think there is something to overcome there. But I think, again, it goes back to what we talked about. If you have as much business acumen as the people who are in the engine room of business, people see that. Like, they know that it's different. And I think there are a lot of awesome practitioners out there who operate that way. But there's also a lot. And we recruit a lot of people, and I'll ask them, what was your interaction with HR? And they're like, I don't even know who was in HR at my last company. That's a fail. And I think it's a balance because, and we talked about this a little bit, there's strategic HR, but then also it is human resources. So if you don't have any humanity, if you don't interact with people on a one-to-one basis, you're just another executive that they don't see. So I think it's a tricky balancing act, but spending time with people where they are, whether it's their personal challenges, whether it's their work challenges, whether it's their personal successes, whether it's their work successes. I think that makes a difference to people. And it's gotten lost in this era of, oh, we're going to have applicant tracking systems, or we're going to have an HR system that provides all the self-service. So you don't have to do all that yucky work, HR person. Some of that is still really important. And if you don't do it, you don't know your talent. You don't know, again, what they're going through, and you're just a cog in a machine. And I just don't think that's the answer either.
So my takeaway from what you just said is just like the organization as a total, we have to understand our customers, our prospects, our ideal customer profiles, like better than anybody. If we can do that, that's going to lead to customer success. What I'm taking away from what you're saying is it's our job as HR professionals, as talent professionals, to know our audience, who is our own employees. And if we don't truly, if you're the HR professional that nobody even knows who you are in the organization, you don't know who they are either.
And you're delivering programs and services blind, basically. Again, it goes to this notion of, I know what's best for you. And I thought we had gotten past that. But so often I see that's actually because of probably challenges with staffing at some point, and just the misappropriation of value for an employee is feeling like they're not a number. And if you self-serviced away all of HR, you're probably going to feel like a number. It's a tricky thought to be on.
What haven't we talked about? In order to be this strategic HR leader, to be a business and HR executive at the same time, what haven't we talked about yet that's important for us to know?
Yeah, I think it's because of the political environment a little bit. The terminology around diversity has become a little bit of a polarity. People are taking sides on it. And I think lost in that is a couple things. One is the companies that were serious about it are still serious about the fact that a different set of ideas ends in a better business result. I don't think you can challenge that. And people often forget about it because they think of diversity in some of the political context and some of the labels that are out there. So I think it's important for us. It's not an HR program ever, but if not someone in talent or HR, who's going to do it? Number two, I think it needs to be tied to business outcomes. Again, going back to strategic, and there are certainly some aspects in this space that you have to do or you should do, but ultimately the outcome is what I want to focus on and work backwards from that. And if you're doing that, as you think about talent, whether it's early talent, mid talent, or executive talent, it's factoring into your decision process and into your discussions. But again, I think it's cultural. It's not a program. It's not a fancy term that you throw around because you think it's going to get you more customers, or it's flavor of the month kind of thing. It has to be something that kind of threads through everything you do. So I think that's important. And I think it's a time where we shouldn't take that off docket. And some places are.
So do you have a story, something you could tell us about an initiative or something that was tied to a business objective? No names, no numbers or anything, but just like, how does it come to life? Do you have any kind of a story that you could share with us?
Yeah, I'll think of one recently. Not all of these end up in success, but I think the notion of, I spend a lot of time with people in the industry, and out of one of these discussions, a former friend of mine's like, it seems like you're having a lot of fun. Like, I'd like to do that at some point. It was in a line of business that we were not in. And like this individual, like, I wouldn't even think he's in a good spot. He's at a point in his career where he's probably got 5 years left. So you wouldn't think he specifically would want to entertain going from an established insurance place to a 3-year-old company. And it was literally over a dinner, which was a social dinner. And I was like, hey, let's explore this because this could be a win. And so out of that, we entered in discussions and then had basically non-disclosures where we're talking about business plans. So I think that was out of one dinner with no intent to go there. So I think every interaction has the ability to lead to something, even if it's just a reciprocal information exchange, or it could be a fantastic business idea. That's not my core function, but I think it led to a good discussion and we're still chatting about that. We're not a success yet, but I would say since I've been here over the 3 years, that's happened a dozen times. Some of them led to something cool. Some of them didn't, but all of that made us, I think, better as an organization. And as an example of kind of what we talk about, which is constantly prospect for ideas, even if they're not for us necessarily. Some of those will come inside our four walls. Some just might be something that we park and come back to you later, but I think that's what I endeavor to do. And I learned something from those discussions. So I guess that's my end goal, is always to learn to help people in some way.
I love the term prospect for ideas. I love that. That ties back to what you said at the very beginning of the podcast is we're all in business development. It ties into your curiosity, but you're acting on it. You're taking that as a part of the role to bring in ideas that are going to change the company, help the company. Not every idea you solicit is going to be a good one, but if you've had at least a dozen of those conversations, you've had some really good ideas that have really helped. So I love that prospecting for ideas. I'm going to remember that one. Tell me, what's something in your role as a chief talent officer that you're really proud of?
So we started 3.5 years ago and there were two of us. And now we have about 450 employees globally. So as a general sense, that's something. But I'd say what I'm most proud of is, and I look at our folks in groupings. So we have our executive level talent. We have our leaders and managers, and then I put early talent in a separate bucket because I'm really passionate about that space. I think it's going to bring a lot of change to the industry. But in each of those buckets, like I am super biased. I'll be the first person to admit it, but I'll put our talent against anyone. And just how I've seen people progress over the 3 years. 3.5 years ago, we didn't have technology, we didn't have claims, we didn't have all these groups, and we've built these groups up. It's been the coolest thing ever. They're like out in the market winning. So that's the big one, a squishy one, but it's meaningful to me because I never thought I'd get that chance to participate in that. It goes back to what we talked about too, which is if our culture isn't what we want it to be, we have absolutely nobody to blame. We've hired everyone. We've Lego blocked this together. I think it's harder for those that enter a culture, particularly a bigger company, to move the Queen Mary. But at the same time, I think it goes back to what we said, which is it's every day you have to stress test it because everyone's going to drift. It's just the nature of the beast. So you really have to focus on every hire, every discussion, and then adapt over time.
So I've got one last question for you. And that is, because we've talked about a lot, if there was one takeaway that you wanted people to have from consuming this episode, what would that be?
It's not like an epiphany takeaway, but I think it's an important one. I think listening is the cheat code. And I really think it's a bit of a lost art in this world of you've got screens and emails and phones. You really need to spend time with, regardless of function, the people you work with, particularly people that aren't doing what you're doing. And I think it'll make you better. And it'll raise things in your head and challenge assumptions that otherwise you would not. So I would just encourage people to invest more time in that and less time in all the distractions and, again, making assumptions, because I think that's what people in a lot of companies are expecting from you, whether you know that or not.
I love that. I am going to take away the prospecting for ideas because if you don't know what you're going out there for, you're never going to find it. So if you're going out for ideas, then you're going to get yourself into a situation for it. So I can reiterate, I love your takeaway of listening, but it's listening for a purpose. There's something you're learning, which is going to make you a better individual that's going to grow the company, that seat at the table. Tony, I know people are going to have questions after this. Would it be appropriate that we gave out a link to your LinkedIn profile that people could reach out?
That's totally fine. Yeah. You'll see that I'm somewhat active on there, so I will not resist. I'm open for questions. And if anyone wants to link with me, I'm happy to engage in that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing all of your insights. And I think you're giving a lot of hope for a lot of people in HR because there's a really big role that we all play. And I think you articulated it extremely well today. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks for your time, Steve. Happy holidays as well.